Hello and welcome. My name is Peter Waxman, and I hunt for arrowheads. I used to hunt for them up in Concord, Massachusetts, and then I moved down to Woods Hole, Massachusetts, and I have been hunting for arrowheads in southern Massachusetts and adjacent Rhode Island. I also spent several years hunting for ceremonial sites in the woods of New England. I wrote a book about that. If you're interested in how you hunt for ceremonial sites, there's the link in the description below. And I want to say a few things, about the first Americans, just to get to the point. I think that there's too many different ways into America, too many different locations in America that have their own chronologies that are of equal importance and of equal interest. I think we'll probably never get the dating as precise as you need to say this event. There was an event here that was just 5 minutes before this event here, or 5,000 years before that event there. And in some ways, not only is the dating perhaps impossible, it's also kind of irrelevant because it makes it sound like these sites are in competition with each other. And also it's based on the assumption that there's only one people here at first. And I think, I feel, bear with me, I'd like to talk about some things that we all know to say why, uh, in some ways, that's just a consequence of thinking there's only one way to get into America. And so now to get a little bit more to the point, to me, the discovery of footprints in New Mexico at the White Sands um, dune area that are firmly dated to 23,000 years ago, or between 18 and 23,000 years ago. This really, you can't argue with this result. You can see people trying, but it says that there were people in America right at the height of the glacier. There's no um, ice-free corridor where they could have gotten in that way. And it opens the door to thinking about a much broader span of time where man could have been in America. And I want to discuss some of those things. Let's see, I have some notes. And the main thing is that the White Sands happening in the middle of the glacier says that when people got to America isn't necessarily connected with the most recent glacier or its timing. And if you accept the evidence of people drifting around on rafts of vegetation and or in boats with deliberate seafaring, if you accept the realities of maritime arrival in America, there's so many different ways that people could have gotten here. And in every likelihood, people got here not in a single migration, but more as a diffusion of people into America. So I want to talk about some of the assumptions that have led to the idea of first Americans. So let me talk a little bit about the background for the idea of first Americans, what's sort of the history of a very quick, down and dirty version of the history of archaeology. So when Columbus and those guys first got to America, what they came across was people and it didn't take them too long to realize that these were not Chinese or Indians, Hindus, uh, Indian subcontinent people. That this was a new world. And who were these people? First of all, they were subservient people because they're offering tributes to Columbus and his guys. And then in other versions of the same picture, you have a noble white man with a cross arriving to teach the bare-breasted savages um, how to not eat each other. And they encountered strange people and strange creatures, and it was considered a new world. And the Bible was supposed to be the ultimate authority on who was where. and it didn't have anything to say about this new world. And that was confusing to people who believed that the Bible was the basis of reality. And one possibility that was considered over time was that the people in America were the lost tribe of Israel. I don't know how that idea came and went, but it didn't persist into modern times. In modern times, as I understand it, before the finding of the Clovis fluted points, it was understood or believed that humans had been in America maybe about 5,000 years. I want to say that at all times, the appreciation or evaluation of who were the Native Americans was sort of, they're an afterthought. The attitude towards understanding them has always been chauvinistic, racist. It's always dismissive and diminishing the capabilities, the abilities of primitive people. In the same way that we dismiss the capabilities of earlier forms of human, so that modern Homo sapiens could use boats, but the idea that maybe Neanderthal used boats, that would be not possible because poo-poo to the past. And similarly, you have seafaring at 65,000 years ago, because were people in Australia that you can't get there by drifting mats of vegetation. You have to actually build a boat, be able to do sophisticated things. And it's hard for modern people to allow that 65,000 years ago, there were people who could build boats. Although we now find evidence that people did a great deal of drifting around on grass of vegetation. I like that idea, because they say that monkeys came from Africa to America by drifting rafts of vegetation when Africa was closer to the America. But those same monkeys have never drifted across the Gulf of Mexico from South America to North America. And the same distances of drifting could get you from Asia to America. You had a drifting mass of vegetation up in the Arctic areas. In any case, it's well known that man was able to sail 65,000 years ago. And with the discovery of the White Sands footprints, the whole question of when did America get populated is no longer attached to the timing of the glacier. So if you allow for it, I'm going to just sort of take a quick look at my pictures here. I want to say that let's take a quick look at how the timelines were formed. The original timeline was that there was no past to America. People had never been there. But then, after going through the ideas of lost tribes and primitive people, they accepted that, there was a different kind of people living in America, and they were there maybe 5,000 years ago. They're all the same people. They all walked across the Bering Land Bridge. And then when the Clovis theories came about, and I assume the listeners, know the story of finding a fluted Folsom point lodged in the vertebrae of an antique form of bison. They knew the date on that bison was older than 5,000 years, and they switched the clocks, switched the thinking, switched the conventional thinking to the scheme of these great game hunters coming in from the Bering Land Bridge, and populating the whole country and killing off the megafauna. A very pleasant idea. And there it sat since about 1920. And what was very nice about the Clovis story was that it divided the past in America into a nice stable theory, which was that during the Paleo period, timing from 13.5 to 12.2 thousand years ago, during the Paleo period, and maybe a little bit more recently, there was one kind of people who made fluted points. And then somewhere around 9,000 years ago, they began to be replaced by people who made different kinds of arrowheads. And that was called the Archaic period. The Archaic Indians were supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers, and they persisted until the time that agriculture and pottery began to be used throughout. Excuse me. And so we had the Archaic period, which in the East around 2,000 years ago was replaced with an agricultural period called the Woodland period. I don't know if it's called the Pueblo period out west or the Southwest, what that more recent bit of prehistory is called. I'll just call it ceramic because it's from the use of pottery. You might also call it Neolithic because the stone tools were, there were ground stone tools as well as flaked stone tools. In any case, the chauvinism of early researchers or early thinkers was always tempered with a kind of a more grand scheme of, look how nice and stable this theory of first Americans is. So you had a chauvinism combined with a very, comfortable theory, and that theory has been um, omnipresent ever since, which I don't know, up to 1920s, we weren't around. In the 1950s and 60s, what the thinking was. But it never went beyond Clovis until they found the white sand. So I just wanted to comment a little bit about timelines and what else I'm going to comment on. Mainly that once the white sands discovery was made, the door has been opened to a much broader and deeper past. There are other important early sites besides White Sands. If you're like me and you're interested in archaeology and you watch YouTube videos and make YouTube videos, you'll be aware of Monteverde in Chile, which supposedly was firmly dated to 30,000 years ago. But of course, Chile is just too far away. Easy for American archaeologists to ignore it. American archaeologists in general are not very well trained. They don't recognize stone tools, and there are individual efforts in specific sites that are extremely valid and useful. There are a few global experts like Dennis Stanford and Bruce Bradley, and I assume that you've watched videos about those. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania also had reasonable datings that were older than Clovis, and they found things below the Clovis layer. And then there's a Galt site in Texas where they found Cactus Hill in Virginia, Galt in Texas. They started looking below the Clovis layer and they found primitive stone tools. And there's always some argument against why that's not real. But people who pay any attention to what stone tools look like knew that there were things before Clovis. But I would say that the White Sands somehow it's a different, much more compelling, much more human story than stone tools, which is unfortunate because I love stone tools, and stone tools are, I think, the backbone of archaeology. But the footprints are human. You can see traces of places where they were dragging things, kids playing. And that discovery, I think, has finally nailed the coffin shut on the idea that the Clovis were the first people in America. So we now have a much broader timeline. That's the background for today's archaeology, today's thinking about the first Americans. So let me talk about the assumptions that go into there being first Americans. There's the assumption that you had to enter America via a coastal route, that you had to come via the Bering Land Bridge when the glaciers were as they were. Land bridge. Let's take a look at what happens if you open the door to a deeper past that's more beyond 5,000 years, beyond 13,000 years. What you get is a timeline, or what you get is a picture of the glaciers that you don't have to look at the last low point of the glacier, which is this, Wisconsin last lobe 25,000 years ago. You can also look at a previous lobe, which was about 60,000 years ago. It could have come then too. We know that they were already using boats, but there was a land bridge 60,000 years ago. The glacier was at a high point 140,000 years ago, 50,000 years. Was it before 100,000 years ago? About 140,000 years ago, there was another lobe of the glacier, the low point, more land bridges, more opportunities for drifting vegetation, and boats would have been available all throughout. And then about 180,000 years ago, there's another low point when you could have walked across. And here's an important point about the populating of the Americas. If you allow for 2, 3, 4 glacial lows when the Brand Bridge was available, reaching back to about 180,000 years ago, it's believed, and probably with much less controversy, that a variety of mammals, specifically mammals, came across the Bering Land Bridge, let's say at that 120,000 year ago glacial low. My favorite example is bighorn sheep, which were a prey animal for later Native Americans. And they say that the bighorn sheep came across the Bering Land Bridge about 100,000 years ago. Now, nobody talks about them migrating across the Bering Land Bridge because you don't have bighorn sheep making important decisions for their people and say, we will migrate. They diffused across. They just wandered across. So you look into the history of early human types. So you've got Homo sapiens, you've got Homo neanderthalis, you've got more recently something called the Denisovans, Homo denisovan, that was in Asia. You had Homo erectus, which is generally acknowledged as being the species that got out of Africa and got around. And there are traces of Homo erectus in Indonesia and quite a lot of vegetation, rafting by vegetation, bringing primitive humans out to the island of Flores, where it almost seems as if those creatures, the hobbit, was an Australopithecine, not derived from Homo sapiens, not a result of island dwarfism, but actually a small hominid. And that's, millions of years ago. So by 200,000 years, I saw a date yesterday where they're saying, no, we now believe that primitive Homo sapiens existed 300,000 years ago. So if you think about Asia, the source of the bighorn sheep, also having hominids in it of at least one or two different varieties. Homo erectus could have been in there, Homo neanderthalis, Homo sapiens, all were existing in the planet from 200,000 years ago. And so they could have walked across with the bighorn sheep. They could have chased the bighorn sheep. The idea that hominids would not go someplace where large numbers of varieties of mammal species were already coming across the land bridge is, I think, implausible. So if someone says, no, man couldn't have been here 200,000 years ago because for reasons which I can't be too clear about, if someone says that, you're going to say, well, okay, how do you know? Why would hominids not migrate where everybody else was migrating? Or if not migrating, diffusing? You'd have to explain why man didn't get into America if he was in Asia, and if Asia was connected to America, and if lots of animals were going back and forth across that land bridge in those earlier glacial times, why would some form of man not have done exactly the same thing? I think the shoe now should be on the other foot. You say he didn't get here before 200,000 years ago? How would you prove that? Okay, I think the problem is that in America, you haven't found enough fossils of fossil human to make any sense out of it. It's interesting. America does not have a lot of fossils. We don't. For example, as I understand it, only one skeleton has been found of a Clovis type person, a girl skeleton somewhere. So here you had this huge big picture of Clovis all around America, but no skeletons. So supposing you go back another 10,000 years and there's no skeletons, but that doesn't seem to really matter much. So the sad part is that America doesn't have more fossils, and I think eventually they will find fossils. They've found, I believe they found Neanderthal-like skeletal remains at Pedro Furada in Brazil. And I think the picture that I come to believe is that now I'm going to go look at ocean currents. So this is going to be in the context of various belief systems. So people believe that man had believed that man could only come in via the Bering Land Bridge. So if it's a pipeline, and then anything in the pipeline has to get through the pipeline before the next thing comes through the pipeline. And so you have to have a first thing through the pipeline. But if it's not a pipeline, if there's many, many different routes into America, and I see a number of different possible landing places. If you look at the ocean currents, there's a current that leads from the Arctic down into New England. There's a current that leads from Northwest Africa over to Virginia and into the Caribbean end of Virginia. There's another current that leads from Southern Africa over to northern Brazil or side of Brazil. And you could drift. It takes apparently about 6 weeks or something to drift across. And even if they're not deliberately seafaring, that people have been able to live on the surface of the ocean for indefinite periods of time. In the past, because it rains occasionally, you get fresh water, and fish start following your raft. And there are tales of people surviving for long periods of time on rafts. So then if you were coming via the Pacific, the longer route into America, there's a current that comes from somewhere around Japan into California, goes down the coast. There's another current coming from, it's called the equatorial current, comes and goes to Central America and South America. It's also a Southern Pacific route that leads to places like Monteverde in Chile from presumably the Polynesian island direction. So with all these different routes into America, it's less plausible to start talking about this route delivered people to America before that route delivered people to America. And it's really counterproductive to spend too much time thinking about who came first. If there were early hominids or humans in Asia, they could have been in Africa. They would have been in Africa. They could have drifted across, or they could have sailed across deliberately. After 60,000 years ago, the two glacial lobes ago, it's known that people could have come to America by boat, and presumably they did. Why wouldn't they? Humans are, if you're not going to be dismissive of the past, and if you acknowledge that past peoples had advanced capabilities, mankind in one form or another would have gotten here before the glaciers made it easy to walk here. So also another assumption is that it was one migration, which is kind of ridiculous. I think the pressure would be on once this hominids are diffusing around. It's going to be lots and lots of different people coming at different times, and they don't have to all come in from one direction. So since it's no longer a single pipeline, it's no longer really very meaningful to talk about first Americans. I think you can look at cultures and where they moved on the landscape, or you can look at landscape and look at the cultures that occupied that piece of landscape. And I prefer the landscape first view. So pause. So I don't think it was one migration into America. It was probably multiple diffusions, continuous diffusion. It's not an event. It's a continuous pressure of things to equalize throughout the planet. And another assumption I find troubling is that the species that came across would have been Homo sapiens, because after all, no evolution of man could possibly have happened in America. Whereas, as far as we can tell, there were two or three different types of hominids or more in Asia 200,000 years ago. And as we've seen, there's been at least four opportunities for those species to walk across the land bridge back and forth in both directions. And so we could have had Australopithecines in America. And given the timing of things, we probably did. We haven't found any skeletal traces of them. We found traces of them on these islands in the Pacific. There could have been Denisovans coming across. There could have been Neanderthals coming across. Although the Neanderthals are sort of a European cold weather phenomenon, they're more likely to have gotten to America via the Atlantic than the Pacific. My own favorite entry point into America is the one where the Gulf of California, at the northern end, we're separating the mainland from Baja California. At the northern end of the Gulf of California is the mouth of the Colorado River. Anybody coming up the coast of Mexico might find themselves at that spot. They go furthest north that they can get, and then you're in the Colorado River, which might have been pretty navigable for a while, leading up into the Las Vegas area. So that's an interesting possible point of entry. Might have been a point of entry for some peoples at some point. So I just want to point out that let's have a look here. You've got Denisovans, or supposedly look a certain way. You've got different renditions of Denisovan man. You've got Homo erectus. You've got Homo neanderthalis. Any one of these could have come to America, and in fact could have evolved into Homo sapiens and then gone back to Asia from America. We don't know that it's a single species. And once the doors are open 200,000 years ago, someone has to do, it's got some explaining to do. They're going to say that, oh, other mammals and things were easily, mice, etc., were coming across. Horses were going in the other direction across the land bridge. But all of the abundant hominids that were in Asia, you'd have to explain why they didn't get where all the other creatures did get to. So with the doors open, the fact that it was just one species is no longer a reasonable assumption. You cannot assume that early man or early hominids in America were Homo sapiens. The timing just doesn't support that assumption. So you could have had a Homo erectus here, could have had Homo neanderthalis here, could have had Homo denisovan here, and could have even had some Australopithecines. But I do want to comment about the Denisovans, that there's very little skeletal evidence for Denisovans. They found a finger bone, I guess was the basic starting point for understanding the existence of Denisovans. And they recently found a skull, or reevaluated the skull that they had in the collection, that it determined that it was, first of all, it was Denisovan. Second of all, it was a really big skull. And they haven't got a lot of other skeletal evidence for the Denisovans, but there's the possibility that they were kind of giants. Unlike the hobbits of Flores, they were the giants. And there are oral tradition stories of giants in America, and lots of them, and people dismiss that. My favorite one is the Lovelock Caves in Nevada, where they had red-haired giants who were cannibals, who, if the vague stories are to be consolidated into what coherent picture, the humans that were living near these cannibalistic giants, didn't like them very much, and killed them, smoked them out. So the Lovelock Caves ceased to house giants, but the idea was, you're thinking they could be Neanderthal, it could be Neanderthal, but Neanderthals were short in stature, they're stocky. The hominids that were big were the Denisovans. So perhaps there was a component of Denisovan still living within the framework of that oral tradition encompasses. It's an interesting thought. And it's known that the Native Americans have a certain amount of Denisovan DNA and they have a certain amount of Neanderthal DNA. And of course, since Native Americans are always being dismissed and underestimated, of course, they only got those admixtures of non-Native American genetics via contamination with European people. So I don't think that that's true. And I think that as someone evaluates which, apparently a lot of people have, some 10% or something Neanderthal genes, but that if you look at all the different people in America, 60% of the Neanderthal genome is represented by different people. I think if you looked at the amount of the type of the part of the Neanderthal genome that is present in modern Native Americans, you might find that it's not the same as the Neanderthal component coming from modern Sweden, say. And it's different DNA. And maybe they also have Denisovan DNA, apparently, at some level. And I dare wonder if that's the same the same genes as the ones in Europe. If not, then the arrival of other earlier humans like Denisovans and Neanderthals would show up as a genetics character, genetic profile. Within the genetic profile of Native Americans, it was different from the DNA and the genetic profile of Europeans. My guess is that if there was any evidence to that effect, it would be suppressed because it's contrary to the belief that there was never anybody here of any significance at any time other than, people carrying crosses, spreading the word, which is not true. There were earlier people here, and we will learn about them as the evidence unfolds. But every discovery leads to a widening of the possibilities, not a narrowing of them. And American archaeology has not settled into a new paradigm with Paleo, Clovis, woodland, Paleo, Clovis, a Clovis, Paleo, archaic, ceramic. That stable theory has been disrupted. Now we have open-ended past. We are more receptive to the idea that Americans arrived by different routes. They were not necessarily human, modern human, and they weren't one people. And so let me talk about some individual sites for a moment. Just some of the things you see. I see a number of videos. Well, so archaeology videos, if you watch them, there's certain different types. There's the Galt site and the first people of America. There's the Deborah L. Friedkin site and the first people of America. There's various videos about Cactus Hill, Meadowcroft, and the first Americans. And so you've got people who have dirt under their fingernails talking about the place that they've been. And some people have been in a lot of different places and haven't got a global perspective. You also see videos about local archaeology societies where they're doing research on the teepee rings of northwestern Oklahoma. And they are telling you new details. But there's this desire, everybody wants to feel like they're figuring it all out. So even the people who have dirt under their fingernails and know individual sites may be giving lectures about the first peoples in America, the people in the Americas. And I would say that 95% of what was on YouTube, at least a couple of years ago, was Clovis first walking across the Bering Land Bridge. And then some of those videos have an extra little addendum, which the guy, when they found out about the white sands, they edited their videos to make it sound like, oh yeah, but really there were some other people here, but they don't actually have much thought about what that means. And they're still basically promoting. So you've got a lot of videos, not from experts, from people who don't have any dirt under their fingernails, neither local experts nor in any way global experts, putting out videos about the first Americans. And you can be sure that there's going to be a picture of a mammoth and some shaggy-haired individuals pointing with pointed sticks, walking near these mammoths. And I can't remember what I was going to say. But so these people who are just writing videos about other people's discoveries of archaeology, they're not really adding a whole lot of value to it. In fact, it's all misinformation, most of what they're saying. They're covering things, places you've been, things you know. They don't have, I'm going to show you. They don't have the dirt underneath their fingernails. They don't have buy points. They have potatoes for prepared core blades to puzzle over, wondering how does Solutrean technology get up the Colorado River to the Las Vegas area. So people who don't have experience seem to be making money on YouTube promoting what today should be considered misinformation. A lot of different efforts in archaeology, some of them quite passionate and serious, others sort of literary. And what did I want to say? Well, I wanted to say you've got the Galt sites and the Deborah L. Friedkin sites and the places like Actors Hill, where when you dig below the Clovis layer, you find other stone tools, which are sort of similar to each other, sort of triangular arrowheads, not fluted. Um, so then you've got the sites in Chile, Monteverde, that are supposedly 30,000 years old. And I think now people are going to be more receptive to those dates, also Metacroft and Galt, etc. Because I think, to me, the White Sands discovery really turns the corner for American archaeology. It's the thing which finally says, okay, your Clovis first stuff is pure fantasy. And actually, somewhere along the line, people are going to realize that if Clovis first was arriving by the Bering Strait, there should be more material around the Bering Strait, and there isn't. Uh, the majority of material for Clovis is around Delaware and what is it called, the Delmar Peninsula of the is that in the Carolinas, suggesting that they arrived via the currents that lead to Virginia. But it's not a fight that's worth having at this point. Because presumably people, in my opinion, people were coming from every direction anyway. I think Clovis-like people were coming in. I like the Solutrean theory as predecessors for Clovis because there are Solutrean style blades to be found. I'm going to edit out these slow pauses if I care anything for my viewers. I've mentioned White Sands quite a good bit and how it opened up it's now at least 23,000 years ago is the past of America, no longer glacial dependent. But there's another site which I would like to mention. I should mention Calico, and I want to mention Cheruti, but I'll come to Calico last. Cheruti, I guess, is that a person, a place? It's a person who was involved in the road widening project in San Diego, where they uncovered mammoth bones that had been fractured when they were still green or young. And it takes quite a lot of force to fracture a mammoth bone, eye bone, for example. And they also found large river rocks, large cobbles, with the mammoth bones. And there was no river there. The river was some quarter mile or so away. And so somehow rocks from the river got moved over to a place where mammoth bones were crushed. And the theory, which doesn't seem too implausible, was that a human carried the rock from the river over to the place where they smashed mammoth bones. There's nothing else that smashes mammoth bones when they were green and fresh. It was suggested that bulldozers had broken the bones when they were widening the highway. No, these bones were broken in prehistory long ago. And the thing that's troubled everyone was is that the date for the, I don't know how they did the dating, but they determined that those bones were 120,000 years old. Now, people would say, I don't think that's a sign of man because I would have expected there to be stone tools. I also heard someone say that they didn't believe the White Sands footprints because they would have expected more fireplaces from that same time period, and they believed themselves to be experts on fireplace excavation, having excavated a number of fireplaces in the White Sands area. The absence of uh, similar 23,000-year-old dates for the footprints was enough to, the absence of fireplaces, the failure of that expectation was used as a significant criticism of the actual data that had been collected. Now, we can talk about White Sands and just how many footprints per campfire site is the correct ratio to be making that argument with. But usually, the people who say, I would have expected such and such, are not prepared to demonstrate that that expectation has any substance. It's simply their reason for not believing something. So when you come back to this Cheruti or Ceruti site, where the mammoth mastodon bones and river cobbles, the person says, I would have expected stone tools. You can say, okay, but how do you explain those river rocks? And if the answer is, blah, 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 I don't try to explain it, I just don't believe it, and you say, okay, we'll get out of the discussion then. You're not participating. I also like the fact that one of the tusks of the mastodon was found buried upright in the dirt. And obviously, some kind of forces of nature could have rotated it from its natural horizontal resting place up into a vertical position. But another possibility is that it was deliberately buried in a vertical position by the same mysterious ghosts who had carried the cobbles there, smashed the bones, eaten the marrow, buried a mammoth tusk vertically, and left. Because if it was human activity, it's a ceremonial activity. This is what we really want out of archaeology: is little insights into things that individuals were doing in the past. It's recovering those stories of the past that, to me, is one of the most compelling things about archaeology, is seeing humanity in the past. Um, Finally, let me say a few things about Calico. Calico, as you may know, was a place where Louis Leakey came along and said, look, if you dig right here 30 or 40 feet down, you'll hit artifacts, you'll find primitive man, which people regarded as a magic trick because they did find things when they dug down that way. It's not a magic trick because humans follow the water. And if you are standing somewhere on higher ground near the Mojave Desert, you're going to see where the washes and the rivers drained into the desert. It's not going to be any mystery where a water source empties into the desert, that at the foot of it, where it comes from the highlands down into the lowlands, there will be archaeology. It's not a magic trick. Anyway, Louis Leakey said to people, dig there, you'll find stuff. So they dug down and they found broken rocks. And the problem is that those broken rocks were considered, in fact, they're taught as examples of geofacts, things where nature creates something that looks like it was made by man. And you have a lot of people who don't know anything about breaking rocks wandering around claiming that they have figured out how to dismiss Calico. And I watched a video where the Calico site, this is in California, if you don't know about it, had been sort of vandalized and left to rot by the Bureau of Land Management or whoever owns the land. Because these, after all, these weren't man-made tools. They were just geofacts, just nature's broken rocks. And they were making the same kind of claims that had been dismissed over and over and over again. For example, the idea that rocks get broken by a river. There's an experiment you can do to prove that rocks don't get broken inside a river. They get rounded. They don't get snapped. There's other experiments that people have done. And so it's sort of interesting. Scientific progress of one generation gets thrown out and ignored by the next generation. The sad thing is that American archaeologists are not trained in lithic technology. They wouldn't recognize an old wood chopper unless someone told them that's an old wood chopper. It's from Louis Leakey and it's in a museum in Paris, in which case they believe it. But if it came out of a pile of dirt in America, that's just a rock. So there is no such thing as just a rock. Everything has its history. And there's no such thing as first Americans. It's just sort of a vague idea, which when you try to focus on it, uh, it becomes nonsensical. We now have good evidence that there were people here long before the most recent glacier. We can't be sure that they were Homo sapiens. And someday more finds will be made that'll demonstrate the presence of earlier humans in America. So I feel that the idea of first Americans is misleading, counterproductive, and sort of ignorant at this point. And what we should be talking about is the peopling of the Americas. I like that title. Or early Americans. I like that title. But there's no special, oh, this site was the first site in America. It's just the wrong metric to be applying to archaeology.